Hey team, welcome back to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing. I'm Dr. Jerry, as you know, and with me is Dr. Reed. And today we are talking about disappointment. The disappointment you hold maybe within yourself, with others, how that can be destructive and maybe even constructive for where you want to go with life and how you want to revise your reality. So the reason we're doing this is because, as I referenced in a previous 5 Minutes to Thrive, many people have been, let's say, disappointed by how the ending of one of their favorite home box office TV shows went. And it's perfectly understandable. You invest a lot of time and emotions into, watching these things week to week and year to year. And so, you want a story that wraps up very nicely and ties up all the loose ends and just makes you feel good about that investment that you've put in. But, just like TV, life has plenty of disappointments where certain relationships will not wrap up just the way we want them to. In fact, may prematurely end with the life equivalent of a writer's strike or something along those lines. So, Dr. Reed, I was wondering if you could talk about your take on what it's like to be disappointed and where that disappointment comes from.
Yeah, that's a great setup. Thanks. I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that disappointment comes in all shapes and sizes. So disappointment over your television show not going the way that you had hoped it to versus disappointment that maybe you're going through fertility issues because of loss of fantasy about having children is something that you're now grappling with. Those are different flavors of disappointment, although the experience can have some similar aspects.
And that's two extremes,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, they may be, and the set point for disappointment is really depends on the individual, right? Some people may experience disappointment around issues, whereas others might not. And then the other dimension I think that's useful to talk about is sources of disappointment. Are you reflecting on your own behavior? Are you disappointed in the way that you acted in response to a particular set of circumstances or an event? Did you transgress some deeply held and important values of your own? And that's what's the source of disappointment? Or are you disappointed in somebody else for some reason? Or are you just disappointed in circumstances that may or may not be in your control?
Okay. That's a really good point you make because there is this, I don't want to call it necessarily dichotomy, but a difference in terms of being disappointed in ourselves versus being disappointed in others. But I think in both those situations, some kind of sense of morality comes into play. You've transgressed against your own morality, and so you're disappointed that you weren't able to align your values and your behaviors.
Sure.
Or on the flip side, you're disappointed that other people did not live up to your expectations, whether they were objectively or just kind of tacitly implied. And sometimes I think we have to assess whether that was fair that you had that expectation for people in the first place.
Absolutely.
But before we get into that, though, I was wondering if you don't mind, I was thinking about this podcast. I wanted to share some past disappointments that I've had.
Oh, yeah.
Both disappointment that I had in myself and disappointment I had in others, and then how I responded to that in not so helpful ways.
Sounds good.
Okay.
As long as you don't make me share. I have disappointments going back to this morning. if we need some really recent examples that are top of mind, I can pull those out too. But yeah, why don't you?
Well, we'll make you uncomfortable in another podcast. But the first thing that popped to mind, strangely enough, was when I was in high school. I was a freshman in high school. It was my first semester, and I was just taking the normal U.S. history course, and our GPA was calculated based on semesters. So at the end of the semester, you got a grade, and that's what factored into your GPA. And so at the end of the semester, I thought I'd done really well in the course, just enough to get an A, and it turns out I had an 89.4. You needed an 89.5 to round up to an A, and so I went to the teacher, and I asked if there's anything I could do, to bring up that grade just 1/10 of a point so I could get an A in the class. And I mean, we're talking about the difference between, one missed question on a homework assignment.
Over the entire semester, right?
Yeah. To reflect my entire work over the whole semester. And you know what she said to me? She said, well, you're just going to have to try harder next semester.
Wow. Ouch.
And I was so disappointed in myself that I first responded with anger.
Yeah. I was about to say, here comes the grief cycle.
And I think in disappointment, there's a grief process just in general,
yeah.
regardless of what kind of disappointment we're talking about. But after I got over the anger, I was disappointed in myself for not trying just a little bit harder because I knew I was capable of it. And so what I decided to do, which was not so helpful, was for the rest of that year and on well into my sophomore year of high school, I went into what I would call destructive academic behavior.
Wow.
Where I
Say more.
I just did not care. I lost all my motivation. I wouldn't complete homework assignments. I wouldn't study for tests. I wouldn't do readings. I would just kind of do what I had to get by. And my GPA clearly suffered. And then in junior year, I realized, I want to go to college. And I probably need to get my GPA up. And so that's why I started to actually divest my energies in a worthwhile fashion. But because of that one experience, I let that disappointment with myself reside within me for an entire year and a half and suffered negatively academically because of that. But I still went to a good college. Somehow they let me in, and I still graduated. So things kind of worked out, and I was able to make up for that. But imagine if I hadn't had that insight.
I imagine that's a story that probably resonates with a lot of folks. Maybe the circumstances are different, but how many of us have really applied ourselves, put forward a lot of effort, and due to circumstances that were maybe in our control, but perhaps out of our control, we didn't get the result that we wanted. And we imagined the worst was going to happen as a result, and maybe went into some kind of reactive spiral. And it took us a while to pull out and realize, all right, hey, I'm not living according to my values. I'm not living according to what's important to me. Giving up in this way is not going to get me ultimately what I want.
Absolutely. And the first correlate I think of is getting a bad EPR.
Sure.
Or not getting the promotion statement that you thought you deserved based on the work you put in. Or getting the one you feel like you did deserve, but knowing that you might have been able to do better and have gotten a must promote or something like that. Yeah. Or just not testing well or feeling like you could have tested better to make to promote to the next grade. Things like that. I think there's corollary there to where we can internalize that anger and that disappointment and it can really be destructive.
Yeah, I kind of said a little bit about my own personal experience with disappointment early on in the episode. We had been married for a few years and we're looking to start a family, and it just wasn't going our way, so to speak. And that was despite our best efforts, if I can say that kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Tongue-in-cheek.
And through lots of medical intervention, eventually things kind of got going, but there was a period where we just were experiencing this loss of fantasy, right? And we were experiencing this grief and all of these assumptions or expectations we had about our ability to start a family at will. It just wasn't coming true. And we grappled with the disappointment of that. We went through our own grief cycle. There was times when we were just very angry at really not ourselves. We sort of pegged ourselves as victims in all this, but we were angry at other people for not expressing the right kind of empathy, and we got stuck there for a little while. Yeah. And these things tend to have a life cycle. I think they tend to work themselves out spontaneously over time. But that's not to say that we didn't wade through some real thick grief at times because of that disappointment. And I think whether it's academic or something like what I'm talking about, people are well acquainted with the grief or the emotion of disappointment. But I wanted to ask you a question, and I don't want to derail the conversation too much. But there's the feeling of disappointment. And then there's the expression of that feeling, right? So some of this stuff we just sit on and we just kind of we hold it in and we just experience it. But other times we express that, and I'm sort of on the fence about the utility of that. I have kind of a balanced view. What do you think?
I think in general, we are not very good at expressing disappointment in a pro-social, adaptive manner.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that the way it most often comes out is in terms of complaining or angry, bitter resentment towards someone or some kind of circumstance. And I think in those situations, we're really just looking for validation from other people. We're trying to assess whether they share those beliefs and if they can empathize with us and bolster us and say, yeah, that expectation you had, that desire you had that went unfulfilled, that was realistic. You're right, it's not fair. It shouldn't have turned out that way. And that's a tricky, I think, dilemma to find yourself in, because on the one hand, we do need that validation from others in a lot of different things, and we want to, feel that we're heard and understood, and that people can empathize with how we're feeling. But sometimes that disappointment is not exactly rational, and it's based on faulty beliefs or expectations, and or just some cognitive distortions we have about the just world.
Right, and then I think in those cases, complaining or this this attempt to elicit from your environment or from your friends some kind of response to sort of bring people to your rationale or your way of thinking of the world. Sometimes that works, and sometimes friends are willing to indulge you with oh, hey man, I'm sorry. But sometimes people aren't willing to go there with you for a variety of reasons, including the fact that you may just think about the world or hold a set of expectations that's different than somebody else. And so it's difficult for them to express empathy. I think it's worth acknowledging that complaining, which seems to be one kind of vehicle for expressing disappointment, I think sometimes complaining is someone's best effort at getting some need met at the time, right?
Some social need.
Some social need, right? They're trying to draw people in, saying, look at me, I'm experiencing some kind of hurt, or I'm experiencing disappointment. Is there anything that you can kind of do to, bolster me or pick me up, right?
But it's not a victimhood mentality.
Not necessarily.
I'd see it as just looking for social support, as a way of maybe trying to reach out to other people.
Right, and I say a person's best effort at the time, and that just may be because of the state of mind that they're in or the mood that they're experiencing.
They're hurting.
Yeah, if they were in a different place, maybe they would reach out to express that disappointment in more pro-social ways, as you said. So there's assertive ways, right, to express disappointment.
Very true.
Yeah. So, saying what you feel and then, acknowledging where that source of disappointment is coming from, and then maybe asking for what you want or what you would have preferred, especially if the source of disappointment is someone else, saying, hey, I found it really disappointing when you didn't take out the trash after I asked you to do that 5 or 6 times. It means a lot to me that the house is clean, and this is one way that you show me that you appreciate my efforts to clean the house. That was disappointing.
That was a very great example of an I feel statement. That was a quintessential therapist.
Never doubt the power of the I feels.
It is powerful, but I wonder if folks listening to this have some qualms about using the word disappointment when they're using I feel statements, just because I feel like there's a negative connotation with it.
Yeah. It could be a very loaded term. If you dealt with, I go back to childhood when I hear that. I feel disappointed.
I think a lot of us do.
Yeah, and for some of us, just hearing those words from our parents, I'm disappointed in you. Like, oh my God, that cuts like nothing else.
Yeah.
Like my parents rather berate me or yell at me for not picking up my room than say the D word.
Yeah, because it conveys that you lost esteem in their eyes.
Yeah.
That they had a certain expectation or value of you, and you have diminished that perception in their eyes on the basis of your actions, and that hurts.
Right. So caution to the individual who is considering expressing disappointment. There's just, I would say, go about it very intentionally. What is it that you're trying to gain by doing this?
Sure.
Is it getting that social support that you're looking for? And if that's the case, are there better ways of doing it than maybe just out and out complaining? Because people will be willing to listen to complaining, I think, for a little while, but then that gets a little bit exhausting. And having expectations that people may be endlessly willing to listen to your complaining could lead to further disappointment and create a vicious cycle.
And that's good advice just in general. I think a lot of times we will communicate certain things to other people without being really cognizant of what's driving that speech. So, what are we trying to get? What are we hoping to accomplish when we say these things?
Yeah.
Are we just trying to make the other person mad or make them feel what we're feeling?
Yeah.
Or are we trying to drive it in a constructive manner? And I think that's important to, especially in these disappointment-oriented conversations, to realize.
I want to take it back to what you kind of said at the outset of the podcast. You were talking about the role of expectations in this, and you used the word or the term worldview. And I wanted to see if we could talk for a little bit about what the source of disappointment or where that comes from, and if there isn't some way to head this off before it mushrooms into something big.
Thank you for bringing us back. I appreciate that. I think some of it goes back to our innate beliefs, just how we believe the world and people in general work, but also shaped by virtue of our experiences. And so this kind of goes back to one of the other examples I wanted to give. Many years ago, my middle sister graduated from college, and my parents had us all go to this big, fancy dinner to commemorate that event. And it was, just holy smokes, one of the fanciest dinners that I've ever been to. And we're talking 7 and 11 course, meals. And
it's almost lunch, Jerry.
Oh yeah, I know. I'm just so extravagant, and I couldn't believe that this is what we're experiencing. And so I'm witnessing this, I'm experiencing this, and I'm thinking, wow, this is what they did for my sister's college graduation. I'm finishing up my PhD. How much more significant an event is that? Shouldn't I have something that's at least on the same level, or maybe even more extravagant? Oh. So this expectation in my mind starts to build and grow. And I'm fully falling into this trap, and I think you know where this is going. So on the night after my graduation, I've just finished 5 years of grad school, preceded by 4 years of undergrad. I've been in college for almost an entire decade of my life, and this is the culmination of so much toil and work over the course of this time. And my parents take me out to a hole in the wall, shack type place where the best thing on the menu is a Philly cheesesteak that wasn't even that good. And my parents are acting like this is just, it's so great and we're having a good time, and isn't this the kind of food you like? And I'm crushed. I'm completely just not, and I know for a lot of our folks here, they're probably, I don't know what you view about me because of this story, but in my mind, I had blown this up to be something that was going to be so much more than it actually was. And so I was disappointed, not in myself this time, but in how my family members had treated me. I took it as an affront to my value in their eyes, and so it made me really upset. But I think what you're getting at is we carve out these beliefs for how we think other people should treat us, or how the world should work in general. And when that doesn't happen, it leaves us feeling defeated. It can leave us feeling helpless to control some of the things around us, or it just runs right against what we believe to be fair or just.
Yeah, that's right. First, I got to ask the question, do your parents listen to this podcast?
I've talked to them about this before, so probably.
I think a big family conversation is about to happen.
But yeah, it was uncomfortable. But I did address it at the time. I expressed my disappointment, maybe not in the best way. I don't think it was received well. I think it was seen as my expression of disappointment was seen as an affront to their goodwill. And so I think what you're saying about how you intentionally go about expressing disappointment and maybe even practice it can be really helpful.
And I think there's a lot of practicing, to use that word, that you can do ahead of time. There's a lot of preparation, maybe is a better word, because I think that it's worth examining what attitudes and values and beliefs that you hold that may be driving some of the disappointment that you experience. You always have the choice to express disappointment. No one can take that away from you. But it might be the case that you discover that some of the sources of your disappointment are chronic, and they may lead you to be the kind of person who's disappointed in a lot of things a lot of the time.
Absolutely.
And that may have impacts for you at work. That may have impacts for you in your social life and in other areas. And you can decide whether or not that's an attitude or a belief or a value worth holding on to.
Very good point. I think a way that you can start this is by answering the open-ended prompt, I deserve blank.
Yeah.
Because there may be some things just as a human being, in the inalienable rights, if you will, that yes, you should expect to receive, dignity and respect and things of that nature. But if you at the same time say, I deserve to have a 100K job right when I get out of the military, or right when I graduate out of high school, that may be an unrealistic belief. or it may not. But I think you need to evaluate, is this a realistic expectation that I hold, or am I just setting myself up for inevitable failure and disappointment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing, the question I find myself asking myself when I'm confronted with whether or not to feel disappointment, I'll ask myself, is this a matter of preference or is this a matter of principle? Right? And if it's a matter of preference, like I'd like things to go one way versus another, but I wouldn't be crushed if it did, then my disappointment sort of fizzles away and I can kind of move on. If it's more of a matter of principle, it may mean it's going to be more of a sticking point for me and it may require a little bit more critical thinking about how I want to proceed. But I think right off the top, if I can say, hey, I prefer red, but you really like blue, that's not so important to me. I'm going to go with blue and just, let the disappointment roll off my back. But I think where people run into trouble is when they hold this belief that things must be a certain way or I can't possibly be happy or successful or achieve my goals, right? And Albert Ellis, right? He's sort of the father of what's called rational emotive behavior therapy. He came up with this term musturbating. Musturbating is this idea that, there's this kind of, how would you describe it? It's just maintaining this and perseverating with this idea that things have to be a certain way. I have to get my way all the time or I simply can't be X, right? And you can see how that could really wreak havoc in relationships. He also coined the phrase, I think, shoulding on yourself. And again, that's about holding expectations of yourself and others. And to kind of like hearken to, Chaplain Jim's not here today, otherwise I'm sure he'd bring in the spiritual perspective. But if you think about it, kind of Buddhist philosophy, and that sort of unmet expectations or desires is the root of all suffering, right? And it kind of plays into Ellis's idea that if you have to have certain things, first
in order to be happy, or to feel successful.
Right, that's an irrational belief in the first place. I'm sure you can be happy and successful without some singular event in your life transpiring, right?
Sure.
But the tighter we hold on to some of these expectations, especially if they're not really of any value or if they don't have a basis in reality, that could lead to quite a bit of suffering for us. So I think slowing things down a little bit, especially when if you're at that point where you're making a decision about whether or not to express disappointment, really some critical self-reflection. Will life go on after this if I don't get X, Y, or Z? And if that's the case, then maybe you can stomach it.
Yeah. Well, life will go on. It's whether it goes on without you or not. And you're almost touching into the Stoic philosophy.
Yeah.
It is what it is. It happened, it is, and it's your choice to live in it or to move on and pursue other things.
Yeah.
And I really like the idea of just indulge yourself in the grief process. If you absolutely are just crushed by this disappointment, grieve, use it as a learning opportunity to assess some of these things that you discussed. Do I have realistic beliefs and might I need to rectify some of these to keep this from being a recurrent pattern in my life? And then move on. Find another target to divest your energy or your emotional, temporal, financial resources. Something that maybe will better set you up for what you're hoping to get out of that experience.
All right, team. Well, that's it for today. We want to thank you guys for listening to The Pillars, the podcast of the 363rd ISR Wing. Lots of great discussion today. There's lots of great resources out there on this topic. If you're interested, hit us up on the Global, and we're happy to share those with you. But for now, I'm Dr. Reed.
And I'm Dr. Jerry.
And thanks for what you do.